this message of, oh, they're narcissistic, so just leave, it can leave people who choose or have to stay in narcissistic relationships, or who feel scared to leave them or panicked to leave them. It leaves those folks feeling as though that they are weak or that they have let themselves down. This was a tough one to even sort of think about, and even as we were doing the pre-production on it. And I know many, many survivors of narcissistic abuse have been put into the sort of codependency label barrel. But it's a classification that doesn't always fit survivors of narcissistic abuse. And it can actually lead to more pathologizing or even self-pathologizing the person stuck in the narcissistic relationship, and not giving them the kind of education they need about how these patterns play out in the relationship. Instead, the person will say, I'm just codependent, and not learn the things that they need to learn. Codependency is not a sort of an official diagnostic term, or even sort of an official clinical term. It's a term that evolved in the addiction literature, and it refers to the idea of a person making an ongoing investment of their own self-esteem. So they invest their own self-esteem in the behavior and the emotional states of another person. I feel good if they feel good, kind of thing. This is done even when it's not good for the person to be doing that. And then they take responsibility for the other person's needs to the exclusion of their own needs. Folks who are called codependent often experience anxiety around closeness and anxiety around separation. So it can feel like an approach-avoidant dance. And a consistent pattern in people who are called codependent is that they are typically in relationships with people who have maladaptive personality styles. Yes, like narcissistic personalities, as well as people who might be substance users or other codependent people, or people who are impulsive. And as a result, these are relationships that are often characterized by chaos, volatility, and a lot of start-stop. And no matter how bad it gets, no matter how many people weigh in, and even if the codependent person is losing significant relationships, for example, their own children, close friends, healthy family members, they will choose to remain in the codependent relationship. Codependent people may often eschew or turn away help, may not seek therapy, and may enable unhealthy patterns in the partner. For example, continuing to make drugs or alcohol available, sort of fostering the brokenness and keeping the relationship going with a primary fear that if the partner gets better, that they will leave. Now, with that description, I know that more than a few of you are thinking, yo, Dr. Ramani, that kind of sounds like a narcissistically abusive relationship. My best take on that is that it's quite possible that a subset of very severe narcissistic relationships, where no matter how many times narcissism and all the dynamics are described to the person, and there are no real discernible practical factors such as financial, cultural, caregiving that are in play, that some of this may fit. But it's not at all the majority of narcissistic abuse situations. There definitely can be overlap with codependent individuals often finding themselves stuck in compulsive and ruminative cycles like we may see in narcissistic abuse survivors, and a lot of reliance on denial. Oh God, it's not that bad. The relationship's not that bad. There's also overlap with folks who are codependent and folks experiencing narcissistic abuse. Both groups struggle with sadness, anxiety, being on edge, and the physical and psychological effects of chronic stress. So yeah, there's definitely overlap. So let's take a minute and talk about what codependency is not, because that may help a little with clarifying what is really quite a complicated issue. Number one, codependency is not a person who lacks knowledge of what is in front of them. Because codependency is so often based on a relationship with somebody who is using substances, it's clear to them the person in front of them is using. They can see the intoxication, they can see it, and the excuses are about something that's clear. And if it's about other impulsive and dysregulated styles, they see it because they're yelling or screaming or breaking things. And they aren't ready or amenable. The codependent person's not ready or amenable to hearing that this isn't healthy or sustainable. In other patterns, most pointedly narcissistic abuse, the person who's in the relationship often doesn't know they are in a narcissistic relationship. They just don't know it's a thing. They don't know that narcissism doesn't really change. They don't know that it's not their fault. They don't know what gaslighting is. In my experience, in the vast majority of narcissistic abuse survivors, until they read or heard about what it was, they just simply assumed that they were the problem, that these were just relationship problems, and there were just enough good days for say, this has got to be my problem. In a large proportion of people experiencing narcissistic abuse, once they finally see what it is, it's a wake-up call. Not all people leave, but they will. Most people will commit to doing some of what they need to make the situation a little healthier and more livable, and not believe it's not a problem. They know it's a problem. Practical factors may make leaving hard. Number two, codependency is not only just staying for practical reasons. This is a tricky one, because at some level, it can feel like someone is making a judgment about qualifies as sort of real or practical reasons for staying. And that's not black or white. But let's face it, given how family courts operate, some people stay in these relationships because they don't want to share custody. They don't want to be away from their kids. They don't want their kids to have solo time with the narcissistic co-parent. And they don't trust the court to make a reasoned decision. So they feel they can protect their children better by staying in it. Some people stay for very real financial reasons, especially if they might have signed restrictive prenuptial agreements or are part of a relationship where there simply aren't enough financial resources to support two households, or for reasons of disability or inability to work at a job that will pay at a level to support a subsistence life, basically to be able to pay the rent. These are people who would say, in a millisecond, if I had the money, or I had some assurance that I'd have the ability to make decisions for my child, they would be out. Or they may plan to be out once their youngest child is of an age where the family court is no longer an issue. It's very easy to stand in judgment of someone who stays for financial reasons. But let me tell you this, if you've ever been so broke that you were on the verge of not having a safe place to live, you would understand it. Some people may argue it gets hazier when it gets to cultural or religious issues. I don't know if it's hazier. If a person will be stigmatized by their entire community, lose all of their support, or be rejected by the only things that they know, the only systems they know, that's a big ask. I have worked with clients in all of these situations. We work on radical acceptance, ending self-blame, but there ain't a day that goes by in which they see it clearly, grieve the injustice, hope for the day they may not be stuck in it, and do the best they can. But they are no longer issuing excuses for the toxic person's behavior, denying it, or hoping it will get better. A third thing that's not, if you will, codependency. Codependency isn't about staying in a relationship because of the enablers around them pressuring you to stay. In general, the people around the codependent individual are screaming, "Run! Get out of this!" Sadly, the terms enabler and codependent are often considered somewhat synonymous. For many people in narcissistically abusive relationships, enablers make leaving harder. In codependent relationships, the toxicity of the relationship is a little more readily apparent. You might see things like numerous scrapes with the law, chronic substance use, but the partner is still allowed back in. In other relationships, where the emotional abuse, which is still not recognized by so many people and is not often as manifest, it is often the enablers that keep it in place. Number 4 way, the thing that is not, I should say, codependency. Codependency does not allow for radical acceptance or realistic expectations, whereas this is possible in other toxic relationships. For example, in people experiencing narcissistic abuse, this is not something we see in a codependent relationship. Once a person actually gets to radical acceptance, they would probably really no longer qualify under the codependent designation. Like, okay, this is it. is never going to change. I get that. And then make their decisions accordingly. It's a really tough thing to say what is and what isn't codependency, especially when we're talking about narcissistic abuse. And I do think that the overlap zone between the two is not small. But the real smell test is what a person does once they get the information about what this relationship is. They may not leave, but they may also no longer excuse it. I do struggle with how much codependent people are blamed or dismissed for their situations. So much of this is about trauma bonding, and one could argue that codependent individuals have more extreme trauma bonded situations relative to what we observe in other toxic relationships, and exploring other issues like complex trauma become very, very important. Language matters. And for any survivor who is clear about the dynamics and the architecture of narcissistic relationships, whether they stay or go, it's often not codependency. It's often a practical stuckness. And for some folks, getting exposure and knowledge about the narcissistic abuse framework, how all of that works, can actually be what snaps them out of a codependent cycle and into a cycle of more active growth and self-awareness. It's a process, it takes some time, but knowledge, when it really illuminates the room, really argues against what is traditionally labeled codependency. So let's break this down in a very, very simple way for you to understand why this is so difficult. Okay? Ready? It's 3 words. The way we can break this down are 3 words. Don't, can't, and won't. So let's start with can't, okay? Because this is the easiest to understand. You don't leave because you can't leave. It may be dangerous. It may be financially unfeasible. There may be issues with minor children and the whole abyss with family court and all of that. Culturally, it might put you in a risky position or may even be impossible to do within your cultural system without risking such collateral damage that you're simply trading problems. Not everybody can leave. Our systems aren't set up for it. Family court doesn't care what's healthy for a kid in terms of a parent's personality. They just split the kid, and the narcissistic folks are often allowed to weaponize these systems too. Not everyone has enough money. Okay, so most of us don't have enough money. And especially if you live in parts of this country where real estate is very expensive, even if there aren't these, issues, even if it's not like you don't have, it's like you have enough money, but not a lot of money. Starting again for some folks, first month's rent, security deposits, especially if you've been out of the workplace for a while, can also be very difficult. Or even if you were just kept in the dark about the finances or whatever. And then there's, of course, the realities of post-separation abuse, the behaviors that happen when a person leaves an abusive relationship of any kind. And this can include stalking and surveillance, smear campaigns, punitive and harassing divorces, and legal actions. I have worked with many clients over the years who will say that what they endured as part of that whole period of time of post-separation abuse was psychologically worse than what happened while they were in the relationship. And they white-knuckled it, the whole post-separation abuse, and got to the other side. But there were many days when they wondered if they made a mistake. So all the things I'm just talking about is the can't. I can't leave. And it's real. And I'm sick and tired of people asking people in any form of abusive relationship, why don't you leave? They don't leave because it's not that easy. Now we're going to talk about don't. Inertia is real in any relationship. Dismantling relationships, especially long-term relationships, carries lots of logistics, stuff and money and people who are affected. And then there's also shared history, nostalgia, the idea of the devil you know, all of that. So even when a not narcissistic relationship has sort of outlived its shelf life, people stick around. Sometimes you stay in that relationship in a quiet contempt that spans the rest of your life. The don't of leaving is different than the can't of leaving. The don't is the, okay, It's almost the holidays. Let me just wait for a few more months, or I'm just going to wait until I have more of my ducks in a line, or I'm going to wait until I have more money saved up, or I'm just going to wait till I lose some weight. Sometimes don't and can't collide, right? Some folks may wait until minor children turn 18 or are in a position to have their wishes of where to live be heard by a court. So the can't, because of those restrictions, meets up with the don't, because you want to wait a little longer. The don't is a sort of narcissistic relationship purgatory. It's the equivalent of a bunch of unpacked boxes in a corner, even though you've lived in a house for 20 years. Or it's the bills you need to get to and you keep forgetting, or the piles of dirty laundry, or that broken fence that you keep meaning to fix. It's the I know this relationship is toxic and awful, and I can't stand it, and I want to get out of it, and I hate it, but the not finding a way. Apathy is a very real part of the fallout of a narcissistic relationship. There is sort of a fatigue meets exhaustion, meets why bother, meets maybe I don't deserve more than this thought pattern that can really keep people in the don't. The familiar is toxically seductive. So the don't is actually why a lot of people have a hard time leaving. They don't, they could, they don't, and you can get stuck. But then there's the won't. And the won't is where the trauma bond really kicks in. When you talk with a trauma bonded person, a person who at a conscious cognitive level may feel that the relationship is unhealthy, but it feels impossible to leave, many will say that they feel a sense of panic at leaving. The trauma bonded layer cake means that at a primitive base level, it feels like a core abandonment wound, an attachment insecurity being played out. And then as the higher layers of the trauma bond pile up, some of the more cognitive stuff comes up. What if they change? What if they change for a new person? What if they meet a new person and they're so happy and I'm alone forever, having to watch them be happy? It's a mix of all of that. The won't is a sense that no matter how bad this relationship is, ending it leaves a person feeling somatically, physically, and emotionally unsettled and sick. This isn't the can't fear of the post-separation abuse. This is the, I just won't leave because then, and then you fill in the blank. Remember, none of these can'ts, won'ts, don'ts, relationships, any of it happen in isolation. The can't, don't, and won't occur together. So the fears about minor children come up against the not wanting to disrupt a life that has a decent routine on some days, comes up against the sense of panic of how can I live without this? Can't, don't, won't. With those three factors in place, it really is a wonder that anyone ever leaves a toxic relationship. All of this is why leaving a narcissistic relationship is an entirely different game than leaving a non-narcissistic relationship, because those relationships can fade too. In those cases, there may be some can't, there may be some don't want to break up a family, may not be able to afford household expenses. There can be some don't, we both like our jobs, nobody hates anyone, I wish it were different, but right now it's a split vote kind of thing. And then won't isn't as much of a thing. The won't is where the ambivalence and the confusion about leaving a narcissistic relationship really gets difficult. In non-narcissistic relationships, you are balancing more of the can't and the don't, some of which passes with time, and most of which is not stealing your soul and your identity. Listen, there's a lot of content out there that will say things like 4 signs for detecting that you're in a narcissistic relationship. Now leave. I suppose if you're young and you're not living with someone and you don't have kids and you don't have lives that are intertwined, then sure, go for it. Just leave. And even then, some of that won't may pop up for you. But this message of, oh, they're narcissistic, so just leave, it can leave people who choose or have to stay in narcissistic relationships or who feel scared to leave them or panicked to leave them, it leaves those folks feeling as though that they are weak or that they have let themselves down. Can't, don't, and won't are one hell of a triumvirate, because even if you address one of them, the other two are really powerful forces. So even if you get therapy and really address the trauma bond, the post-separation abuse or the family court stuff, the can't, if you will, is still an issue. Even if you address the can't, your kids get older, you get your finances sorted, the won't can keep you stuck. The comfort of the don't, of the status quo, means that even if some of the can'ts get dealt with, then addressing that inertia and the don't, because you don't want the status quo to go, and the trauma bond of the won't, it's a bitch. Be kind to yourself. In a way, not leaving is like getting mad at yourself for not being able to fly on your own power. Gravity is a powerful force. That's not happening. Can't, don't, and won't are the gravity of the narcissistic relationship. So you may wonder, where do I start? Start with the won't. Because once the won't gets addressed, you can get to radical acceptance. You can see the relationship and what's happening in it more clearly. It doesn't mean that co-parenting will magically become easier, or that family court will be more fair, or that $1 million will drop into your bank account. It means that you are not making decisions from a primally pulled sense of, I need this person in my life to feel whole. I feel panicked at leaving it. Once you recognize that you are more whole without them, then you're in a better position to navigate the can'ts and the don'ts. And remember that leaving, it's a little bit of a challenging term. Some of you may never physically leave the relationship, and even then, getting that won't in order is key. Because the workarounds, the creating a life in which you have support, you can be individuated and have meaning and purpose, separate from them, you need to clear the won't away. Leaving may not mean physically moving out or getting a divorce or going no contact, but it may be a radical acceptance-fueled disengagement. And I get it. I see it. This relationship is limited and impoverished. And while there may be some lifelong grief around that, it beats the hell out of being chronically emotionally invalidated and manipulated and forever wondering if it's your fault, or spending a lifetime trying to appease and win them over, or living a life in a false hope that this could get better. You can at least just stop giving a damn about their one-sided universe when you address that won't and you bring in radical acceptance. Does this model apply to other relationships? Yes. Disengaging from toxic family members, narcissistic friends, narcissistic workplaces, narcissistic colleagues. It's very similar. It's the same model where you have to weigh out the can'ts, the don'ts, and the won'ts. Trauma bonding may be a little less at play in a workplace, but if you have a history of trauma-bonded relationships, the mental challenges of leaving any invalidating relationship, feeling that you don't have the right to leave the relationship, wondering if you are sort of wondering like, who the heck do I think I am that I deserve more? It can make these choices and situations more vexing. 3 words, folks: can't, don't, won't, can help guide you into more self-compassion and clarity. So a critical piece of narcissistic healing is understanding the difference between being discerning and being picky. After going through a narcissistic relationship, many people feel that they would never be able to endure the twisted mind experiment that relationship was. They could never go, and then they also felt that they could never enter another relationship at all again. Many survivors feel plagued by trust issues and feel like they could never go all in on a relationship. And on the flip side are people who run quickly into a new relationship because of the fear of being alone. So let's focus on the people who feel like they can no longer trust anymore after having been through a narcissistic relationship. For some people, they feel as though they've gone through, and I've made a video about this, they feel as though they've gone through a loss of innocence and a loss of trust, and that they are sort of painfully cynical now. They wonder if these are lifelong wounds that they will never be able to shake. And this can also grow out of having come from a narcissistic family after a lifetime of gaslighting and criticism and manipulation and invalidation. The idea of trusting and safety with another family feels unlikely, or another family member feels unlikely. And so even in their early years of dating, trust and holding back become the norm. The error that so many survivors make is to view themselves as damaged or somehow broken because they aren't so headlong. They're not so able to just jump straight in to trusting a person. They sort of assess themselves as saying, I'm moved too slowly. I keep my walls up. And this may actually come with a chorus of voices, people telling them, oh, come on now, not everyone is your narcissistic ex. Give this new person a chance. If you keep looking for red flags, you're going to find them. And against that pressure, you may actually relent. You may overlook some red flags, and then you may be back there again. One of the biggest relationship problems we have in our culture is the sort of the magical rapid romance model, the impulsive need to believe in quicksilver fixes like soulmates and magic and signs and messages from the universe, and the need to respond to this magical sign from the universe and make a broken relationship work, right? Well, this is my soulmate. I got to make this work. A very quick and a speed is a sign to some people that it's working. Let's move quick because this is once in a lifetime. As I have said in many previous videos, there is a danger in that rapid soulmate seeking mess. Many a narcissistic relationship started from this place. This focus on speed can pathologize those who are more sort of deliberate in their process, who take their time, who hold on to their sense of self, their own identity, and slowly get to know another person. That's not nearly as exciting as like, wow, we moved in 2 weeks. The sense that many survivors of narcissistic abuse have, that they are somehow not trusting people and somehow closed off, is an unfortunate fallout, again, from this quicksilver magical romance model of thinking about relationships that we've been force-fed since we were children. So for those of you out there who are healing and want to think differently about this, how about we sort of frame this not as being untrusting, but as being discerning, selective, and careful. To be discerning is to respect yourself and not ignore red flags because you think no one else will come along. To be discerning is to hold out for quality. To be discerning is to know that 20 justifications for a relationship a day is not healthy. The fears that we push on people that they will be alone if they don't just go with someone, even if it's not healthy, means that a person then is at risk of ending up in a relationship and that is not healthy for them and harm themselves further by enduring it, and then potentially having to extract themselves from another narcissistic relationship. Maybe this lack of trust and extreme carefulness is the dance of discernment that is a part of healing, of not caving to the enabling demands of the world. If you can give yourself permission to take your time to get to know a new person, a new partner, a new friend, or a new boss, before throwing yourself headlong into something, that actually reflects a sense of self-respect. Not running into fully trusting, but expecting trust to be earned is a part of healing. I am convinced that development of discernment is one of the most central pieces of healing from narcissistic abuse. It's something that many survivors were never taught. We're never taught to hold out for something of the greatest quality for themselves. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse, long before they ever met their narcissist, were never taught to value themselves. They were never taught that their trust is a gift that should be earned and that red flags are real. Ultimately, discernment is a gift you have to give yourself. And then that means simultaneously doing the hard work of being okay with your solitude and with your own company, of not defining yourself by the presence of a relationship. Now, when I say discernment, I don't mean snobby, elitist nonsense, like I have to have exactly the perfect sparkling water. Don't mean that. I don't mean rejecting someone because they wear the wrong shoes or don't have a nice car. I mean the discernment around consistent and sustained kindness, compassion, reciprocity, respect, self-awareness, warmth, and the willingness to see yourself as a whole person and support and respect your goals. That's the kind of discernment I mean. A person who isn't so insecure, and choosing a person who isn't so insecure that they sabotage you, but rather a person who is authentic and good with themselves, so they aren't threatened by your strength or your goodness. Now, discernment is I have to say, it's a kind of a superpower that is a key element of healing. And don't let people write off your discernment that you're cold or distant or fussy or picky or suspicious. Words matter. And this shift in your language, calling it discernment rather than I have trust issues, may help you take off those color blocking goggles and see the red flags as they come up, and also learn to take your time. Discernment is such a critical issue because most people, many people out there, I should say, don't believe they always deserve better and are paralyzed by the fear of being alone. There seems to be a really sort of wholesale assumption, like, kind of just be happy, take what you can get. And in sort of creating that kind of thinking, people often don't give themselves the time to be discerning. And being discerning when it comes to a critical decision, like a person you're thinking of spending your life with, or a person you're thinking of working in a long-term career with, actually really, really matters. So as a critical piece of the healing journey, and armed with what you already know about narcissistic relationships, having survived them, learning discernment becomes a critical skill. So I was listening to something about antibodies lately. Basically the idea, we get an infection, we get sick, antibodies develop, and our immune system develops a memory for that invader. And we develop, these immune cells develop this memory for this invader. And so that means the next time we're exposed to this germ, we could get exposed to it without getting sick. It's obviously much more technical than that, but you get the gist. And vaccinations are meant to be a way to sort of force that antibody response, that memory, if you will, so we never get the illness in the first place, right? So it's a simple formula. We get exposed to the thing that makes us sick. We develop an immunity, or at least a protective response. We don't get sick at all, or we don't get as sick, and that is a good thing, right? So then the question is, could this work for another toxicity that makes all of us sick? You know what I'm going to say. Because theoretically, we should be able to do that, right? We should be able to get exposed to a narcissistic person, get sick, but then just like our immune system, we've developed these antibodies, that there should be this memory that our psychological selves should hold, and then theoretically, we don't get sick the next time we meet the invader, in this case, the narcissist. Now, obviously, the best case scenario would be an all-out vaccine so we don't get sick in the first place. But a lot of us don't have this happen. We get exposed to a narcissistic person, but we still get very sick each time we meet one. Why don't we develop so-called psychological antibodies so we don't get sick the next time we meet a narcissistic person? Well, we can learn a little something from immunology here. First, not all narcissistic people are the same. They aren't. And lots of people will say, I have listened to content about narcissism, read about narcissism. It largely describes grandiose narcissism, right? And it bears no resemblance to what I experienced, right? And this may be because you grew up with a grandiose narcissist, and then you encountered a vulnerable narcissistic person, or vice versa. Frankly, if you go from a malignant narcissistic person to grandiose narcissism, you might say, this is easier, until it's not. A person who grew up with irresponsible narcissistic parents may not recognize the patterns, at least not initially, in a self-righteous narcissist. Or a person who grew up with a self-righteous narcissistic parent or parents, with all the rigidity and moralizing, may feel that the freewheeling fun of a grandiose narcissistic person bears no resemblance to what they grew up with. The heterogeneity, the variability of narcissism, the type of narcissism or the severity of narcissism means that it can look and feel quite different. So just because you have a relationship with one narcissistic person doesn't mean you're going to be prepared for another that comes your way. Just because you have an antibody response to one germ, it doesn't generalize to another. Ultimately, when enough time passes, the patterns will show up. But by then, you're already sick. Think about it. You have to get a different flu shot every year. It's a different strain. Second, there are other things that interfere with our immune response, and that applies here too. So what we know is that as a person gets older, our immune functioning drops, and other factors like genetics or other disease conditions may kick in and make it so that your immune system doesn't work so well. So what could operate in our anti-narcissism immunity, right? What would be factors that would drop our immunity? Things like having a past history of trauma, being raised by narcissistic parents, unresolved trauma bonds, other mental health issues, particularly anxiety, that can leave you more likely to doubt yourself. You may lack power in a given situation or in a given society. All of that can decrease your immunity, make it less likely you'll detect narcissism the next time, or feel that it was too risky to detect narcissism the next time. And both for our physical immunity and our psychological immunity, stress matters. When we are stressed, we get sick. And when we are stressed, either because of the narcissistic relationship or because of other things, we tend to get sicker and may miss a new narcissistic person when we meet them. Third, immune response can wear out over time. Again, back to the flu. We sometimes get booster shots, or the flu changes year over year. So the flu shot we got a few years back doesn't protect us from a new flu this year. That can mean that our immune response wears out. And so what could happen is that you may actually have learned a ton after a narcissistic relationship. You're very clear on the patterns. You're more discerning and you're so aware, and you can smell it when you meet a person. Then time goes by. And the more time perhaps since a breakup or going no contact, you may actually be out of practice. Now, I'm not saying that you should run out there and meet a narcissistic person to boost your so-called immune response. But time away from these kinds of toxic patterns can actually mute that awareness. Listen, folks, I talk and think about this every day. I still get played. We all have a little bit of hope for each new person we meet. And then we get harmed again, and it's tough. But what may happen is that even though it's been a fair amount of time, we still have echoes of that immune response. And then we recognize it quicker and we might distance quicker. Fourth, what is the equivalent of a vaccine? Probably information. You have to know what narcissism is. You're on this channel, so that's a good start. You have to know that narcissism isn't a person who loves themselves. It's not a person who just loves to look in the mirror. It's not just being superficial. It can't really change all the things, right? Know it, because then when you see it, you will be faster to recognize what it is and hopefully disengage a bit. And more information is always a good booster shot. Number 5, it takes a minute. Slowing down can help us have that so-called immune response. The more we slow down, the more we pay attention to who someone is and sit with it, write it out, talk it out, plug into our intuition, our bodies. It makes a huge difference. As long as there is no anti-narcissism vaccine out there, the best we've got is slowing down and taking a minute when we meet someone new. This can also help us not talk ourselves out of it. That's the tough part. Listen, one could argue that mind matters as much as physiology when it comes to the immune response. When we are stressed, how we think does matter when it comes to immunity. And the placebo effect is real. Part of the reason that narcissistic people are so easily able to enter our lives is because we can talk ourselves into them, rationalize, justify, maybe this time it'll be different. And sometimes slowing down gives us time to not fall into those patterns. Number 6, remember that we do feel and experience these relationships physiologically. We feel these relationships in our bodies. So pay attention to how you feel when the angry text from them comes in, or when they give you the silent treatment, or you feel their rage coming up, or how you feel when you're gaslighted. Pay attention to how you feel when you know you're going to have to see them, and pay attention to how depleted you feel when they go. Feel that and pay attention to that, because it can be one of those soft signs you feel when you're getting to know a new narcissistic person. Also, you can pay attention to how you feel before you are going to see them and how depleted or not you feel afterwards, like I said. We walk off with lots of physiological bits of information after we spend time with toxic or invalidating people. Hold on to those. They are like psychological antibodies of sorts. Again, no vaccine. But our past experiences can inform our future paths and decision-making and our awareness about other people. The world may not support you and often act as though you're being dismissive. That's the world's problem, because they sure as hell wouldn't be there to pick up the pieces when one of these relationships goes wrong. But when you sense these patterns, you don't have to run away, but you could definitely step back and give yourself time to see it clearly. And selfishly, I hope you do keep watching this channel daily. Consider it your immune boost. Thanks again.